Hey, welcome back to the Downline podcast, part two this week with my good buddy Mike Gunn here at Downline. We want to use this resource to help people faithfully walk with Jesus while pouring their lives into others. And Mike, I think that's fitting as we pick up from where we left off last week about the kind of early years of Mars Hill. Because obviously at
hmm
Downline, we want to see biblical discipleship flourish in and through local churches. And if you were discipling someone in 2021, 2022, there's a really great chance they were listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. I mean, it was a bit of a phenomenon. Everybody was listening to it and waiting for the next week for the episode to release and all this anticipation. At some point during that process, I kind of stopped and even asked myself, what is it about this particular? I wasn't a big podcaster. I might listen to like an Auburn sports podcast or something, but I wasn't, almost like waiting for a, TV show episode to come out.
Yeah,
Like what
yeah,
was it that was so anticipated? And I had to be honest with myself at a certain point. I don't know if it's because I was a pastor or what it was, but I enjoyed at some level hearing about someone else's failure, which is not like a great thing to admit. It's
yeah,
an honest thing. And then I heard, I either read an article or heard an interview, and someone described it as, and excuse me if this is too crass for some, but as failure porn. Like there was almost this addiction and this
yeah,
allurement to you feel better about yourself watching this Christian celebrity fall kind
yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
Um, and so I want to just kind of stop there and say, and let you say anything you want to on the front end. But a lot of people interviewed in that podcast are your friends, and you know a lot of people personally that went through a whole lot with that church. So we're super sensitive towards that. But what was that like for you, seeing this story become such a phenomenon, and all these people are kind of drawn into it? What's going through your mind as that's happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do want to, make sure I understand that there were people hurt, and I don't want to. Some of my words might sound callous, and that's not what I'm certainly meant to do. Because I know people personally that were hurt. I also saw people that handled it well, and others that didn't. For me, first of all, going through it in 13, 14, or whatever, I wasn't there. Of course, I was by then I was in the U.S. and in a church in Long Beach, but it was really hard. It was really hard. I started calling a lot of people, some of the main people that were not only on that podcast but were kind of instrumental in the bringing Mars Hill down. And it was really frustrating to me for lots of reasons. My wife had to tell me to stop reading stuff. I mean, I was getting sick to my stomach when that started. When I heard about it, because I heard about it through Mike Cosper, well, through another person, and then ultimately Mike Cosper is about potentially being on it. I felt the same way, I think. Why are we doing this 10 years later or whatever it was, 8 years later or something? What's the point of this? Because, is it just to throw someone under the bus again and blame and so on and so on? And not only don't not want to be part of that, but it's just a hurtful time anyways. And so I wasn't too thrilled about them doing it. And I remember saying to him, how come no one's doing a podcast on crushed pastors that congregations have crushed?
Hmm.
Because I'll tell you what, I've been in the ministry for a long time and seen a lot of people crushed by their congregations, and that doesn't sell because
Hmm.
um, abusive pastors or religious abuse is what sells, and religious abuse has become, hey man, I really don't think you should be doing drugs anymore. Oh really? Well, you're abusing religiously. I mean, there's no sense of we can even hold one another accountable because someone might be offended on some of these things. And I've seen this, and I have plenty of examples for that. I'm not being callous there. And so, I saw pastors from 2020, or maybe even a little before that, 18, 19, really being crushed by a lot of things going on just in the world. And then COVID hit. COVID was the grand crusher for a lot of pastors
Hmm.
and in churches. And people don't realize that. I think the average church in America is 85 people,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
many are closing. And pastors work on most of the time massively minimal salaries, make things run with volunteers, not staff. I think people see megachurches and they see something, and they might see a megachurch that is spiritually abusive because there are churches that are spiritually abusive. I get that, but I think people wanted to see that taken down because that's an injustice. And so, let's go after the big church because that's what we see. We don't see the little churches. And some of the little churches are just as spiritually abusive as anyone else.
Mm.
And but I think to deal with it, because there is an injustice in some of those. So let's see this big one taken down,
Yeah.
particularly one that made enough statements publicly that some people didn't like too.
And yeah, so in that, obviously, again, you're super personally connected to the situation. I'm not. Only me via you. I've never even known people that were on staff there. But you mentioned the word injustice. I mean, at some point, even from the outside looking in, you kind of went, yeah, something. I don't recognize the church I planted, type of thing. Is that a fair
Sure.
statement?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the things I was hearing from very close people, I'd say, "Wow, I'm sorry." Yeah, I wasn't there, so I can't address it. But yeah, I would definitely say some of the things,
Yeah.
and even some of the things you could see publicly were just problematic, I guess.
Sure. But what I mean, you study people a lot with just the culture and gospel and stuff. I mean, yes, injustice. We kind of want to see a bigger church come down, and I think some people probably rightfully would so. Like, yeah, I mean, they
Hmm.
couldn't buy it honestly at a certain point.
Hmm.
But if we step back just from the specific example, what is it in us that kind of likes to see other people, even Christians, maybe especially Christians, fall?
I
It's
think
a
it's
weird deal,
yeah.
right?
I think it's inherent because I think really in reality, believer or not believer doesn't matter. We judge ourselves based on somebody else. I mean, that's as simple as that. And if you have, in the Christian world, even as a pastor, you have, okay, this guy was really successful. Okay. And let's face it, some of us become jealous or whatever, whatever it is. Gee, I wish I could have that size church or whatever it is. And I think there's something deep down inside many of us that if that guy fails, then I can be vindicated in some of the things I thought about him, or that he wasn't so great. I think there's a lot of feeling of that, and I also feel from the non-believing side, there's a lot of people that can't wait to see a big guy fall like that because it invalidates the things that he's been saying, even if they're true,
Sure.
regarding some of the culture issues and so on and so on. And so I think that there's two parts of that. One, want to see him fail because if he's talking about marriage and how great marriage is, well, your marriage stinks. Well, that's great. Yeah, I guess you're wrong about it. Or whatever it is that makes him successful. I think we love to see him fail because I think in a weird, really bad way, it puts us in a better light that we're the same as him, and he's no better than us because I think we feel a lot of those guys feel like they're better than us and
Yeah.
stuff. So I think that's deep in the human psyche. I don't know where it comes from other than sin. You know.
It's deep seated. I remember, and by the way, just for clarity, when Mike says him, that's a general him. You weren't necessarily accusing any specific individual of those characteristics, qualities. That's just we've seen guys that have done that, across the board. Yeah, I remember. This is so stupid, but it was we first moved out to the Austin area in 2013, and was pastoring a church right by UT campus, and I'd be sitting there writing my sermons or whatever, and in the back of my mind, I'm probably 30, but I'm 42 now. So it's 12 years ago. In the back of my mind, I'm like, oh, I wonder what so and so would think if they heard me say that, or if Matt Chandler heard me use that line. And then it occurred to me one day, you idiot. One, who cares? Two, he's never going to hear you say that. He doesn't even know you exist. And
Yeah.
like honestly, there was a point in time in my life and ministry where I went from caring about that to not caring about that, and it was almost like a definitive conversion moment. I think God just did it because He
Yeah.
knew what an idiot I can be, and that was really freeing for me. But there's still that thing in me that kind of goes, "Uh huh, yeah, that's what you get for building your own brand, right
Yep.
there. Yeah, you
Yeah.
deserve it," kind of thing. That still
Yeah.
eats at me.
Yeah. And sometimes it validates a positive thing that you think. If a person really is theologically not, going down a wrong place and you think otherwise, you might be right. It's just a matter of our heart and how we think about it, because you could be right about what you think. It's kind of funny because there's been really some public guys that have come out over time, particularly against Mark. I'm not going to say their names, but they're pretty big names.
Yeah.
And a lot of those shots they took early on, I'm talking way before the fall of Mars Hill,
Okay.
some of them were completely unfair. Some were based on hearsay that didn't actually exist. And as soon as he fell, it validated it. You know, yeah, I knew he was arrogant. I knew he was this. I knew he was that. And it's like, okay, yeah, some of those things proved to be true, but not because of everything you said in the past. And maybe you need to look deep into some of the things you did say because they either weren't true or they weren't fair. And so I think I saw a lot of that. I mean, right when we started Mars Hill, so even when I was there all the way up to the fall, I think people felt validated that they felt Mark wasn't theologically the same or ecclesiologically the same or whatever it was that Mark did that they felt was not their the way they would do church or whatever. I think that really validated a lot of guys. I mean, I saw it publicly, and I think that kind of stinks for the entire church, because most of the things they said really had nothing to do with anything but an opinion. And there are some things obviously true, and
Sure.
I wish people got into Mark's life with those. But some of those things I just think were really petty,
Mm.
and the church tends to shoot their wounded. You know?
Well, yeah, that line right there, that is so true. Not in every case, but the church does tend. I love that line to shoot their wounded. I was having lunch back when we lived in Memphis at one of my favorite Memphis spots called Huey's. A shout out, and I was meeting with a really good friend in ministry, and he was telling me about a conversation he had with a guy that's not a believer. Probably agnostic at best. They were eating together. Is the three of them? I forgot who the third person was, and something popped up. It's one of these moments where like Fox or CNN will, like the big gateway scandal in Dallas where the pastor had the sexual stuff or whatever, and it
Mm-hmm.
makes the news. And the Christian at the table, this third party, looks across at the agnostic person and said, "Hey, we would never, like, we're not all like that."
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting response. The agnostic person says, "This is one of my biggest problems with Christianity. You turn on each other quicker than almost anyone else." And
Wow.
that stuck with me of going, here's somebody making an observation
Wow.
of, yes, some of this sin is public and heinous, and some of it's criminal. We would agree with
Yeah.
all that.
There's all that above. Yeah.
But we I think as people can be really quickly to distance ourselves from Christians that do some things, and I think the world watches that.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's petty, but yeah, many times, not many times, but a lot of times you're right. Sometimes it is criminal or something that person needs to be out of ministry.
And
Um,
prosecuted.
yeah, and prosecuted. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with that. But at the same time, there's times when amongst Christians it becomes extremely petty and it's based on some very open hand theological issue or something like that. And that's where I think the world just looks at you guys. What do you guys? I mean, yeah, it's that person you just mentioned that sees that. I don't, we're supposed to be
Well,
defined by unity and love and all these things, and all of a sudden we're hammering each other. When Christ is going to come back. It's
well, and the
like,
tribalism that has been entrenched in the last, I don't know, call it 5 years or so, has been pretty striking. And like you mentioned,
big
you
time.
got eschatology. It could be as almost like the post-COVID period. Things that were dotted lines got drawn as solid lines really quickly
Yeah,
because we experienced so many different opinions during the COVID time.
yeah,
So now you have that, like, okay, if you're not this myopic eschatological view, then you're out, or go fellowship
absolutely.
somewhere else.
Yep.
Or it's sin to have two church services, so you need to, if you don't agree with that, go
Yeah,
somewhere else. It's like all
yeah,
these
yeah,
things going, my
yeah,
word. When Paul's writing to the church at Rome, they don't have all these options. That's one of our problems, I think,
yeah,
in Western Christianity.
yeah,
Is sure you can be that rigid because you can just run down the street and find somebody else that agrees with you.
yeah.
Christianity worldwide doesn't always have that
Right.
availability.
Yeah. And that's it. That's what I see overseas is they don't have that we have, and I think it's not a problem because I'm glad we have different churches, but at the same time it becomes a problem
Sure.
when even if someone does sin and you're trying to help them through that, and they get frustrated and they go to another church. It's like, this is not what we're supposed to be in a community,
Mm.
as a community.
Well, I'll tell you and there were a couple things I lamented kind of listening to that Arise and Fall Marshall podcast. First of all, I lamented, you heard so much pain during those interviews from people, real, genuine pain. And I think whether pastorally or just humanly or just as a Christian, man, it was sad to hear the pain people were going through. And you just kind of wanted to, reach out and give them a hug and encourage. I know we got people in their lives, but man, there was some real sad stuff that people were having to navigate, and your heart goes out to them, right?
Absolutely.
So that was, you kind of listen and go, oh, I wish that. But then here's the other thing that I lamented. Now, this part, admittedly, this is not Downline's position. This is not Mike Gunn's position. This is Jamie Trussell's pure conjecture. I have to say that very clearly. I lamented what seemed to be a little bit of presenting the worst possible narrative of complementarian ecclesiology as could be presented, when, like, there are some horrifically practicing complementarian churches, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
But when that's probably going to be the only exposure some people get, I lamented the fact of going, there really are some that are trying to do it really well, that honor women, that try to teach a biblical perspective, that want women to flourish in their giftings and their leaderships. And they're just these small, these few buckets, right, of serving as an elder or the preaching of God's word, that we can still hold as distinct from men without demeaning women. And so, yes, there are fundamentalist churches that I'm going, I would never want my daughter to go to your church ever.
Yep.
But I didn't love, I guess I was saddened by this may be someone's only exposure to even that idea. And it just, obviously it wasn't the best example to put forward.
Yeah. I think I was saddened by a couple of things like that. One was the complementarian issue. I really felt there was a sense of an agenda. Bringing on Sarah Held Evans or whatever her name was. I mean, these people aren't part of the Mars Hill situation, and why they're bringing in her and the I Kissed dating goodbye guy. Josh Harris. It's like I found the same thing. They wanted to create a scenario around complementarianism that I thought was unfair. I also felt in one of the episodes, I know who it was, and in all, talking about Mark became mean after he became reformed. And I felt that was, and it wasn't challenged. I felt that was really problematic. And the one that I really felt the most problematic with was their opening, deal in every podcast.
The intro.
The intro.
Screaming.
Who the hell do you think? I mean, I wasn't there for that sermon. I think that was well after I'd left and planted another church. And it sounds like some crazy man until you hear the next words. And I didn't hear the words. I mean, it was Alan Parr, who I respect his video and his podcast and everything.
Ministry. He's done some speaking for us at Downline.
Awesome. He's a good dude. He did just kind of like what you're doing, just kind of like, hey, this is my thoughts on it kind of thing. And he played the next words. He played what the sermon was. They never did, as far as I remember. And the next words were Mark really hammering men for treating women poorly. And that changes those words. Now, I remember Alan Parr saying, hey, maybe he should have said it differently. Yeah, I mean, Mark's theatrical in some ways too. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have preached it like that. But to look at men the way Mark does and says, look, he's staring those men in the eyes and just saying, he's challenging them to not treat women poorly. Now, last time I checked, that was something that not only should we be telling men, but I'm pretty sure most feminists would agree with it, that, men have treated women poorly. And it makes complementarianism look bad, too, because it assumes that misogyny. And Mark was hammering, in a sense, misogyny while he's being called a misogynist. And I just found that to be disingenuous. Why are you leading with that? Well, you're leading with it because he sounds like a nut job. That's why you're leading with it. And so those are some of the things I didn't appreciate. There were some things that were good, and I think people could learn from, but I didn't appreciate those kind of handles, and that's kind of what I felt was going to happen when you have so many different voices coming in. I mean, obviously he's not going to challenge every one of them because podcast would be like 50 episodes. So yeah, it's just that was frustrating to me also.
What's it looked like for you post all that coming? I know you still got a lot of relationships. Are you still, and obviously you don't have to say any names, are you still
Hmm?
walking with some people whose
Yeah,
lives you
absolutely.
impacted?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, some of them, a couple of my really good friends, and there's one person that I always like giving a shout out to, not her name or anything, but she handled it as well as anybody. I always felt that, if Mark was going to apologize to someone, it'd be this person, and because I saw her handling it unbelievably, especially compared to some of the other people that should have been able to handle it better. Some. Some of the people should have, not all. I mean, but she did a phenomenal job handling it. Uh, I don't want to say too much more other than the fact that uh, she definitely was done wrong. And it was not just by Mark. And that's the thing that hurt the most. And I just really feel she was admirable in the way she handled it, but I'd love to see her get an apology, I guess.
Yeah.
Because one, she didn't do podcasts and she didn't do all these things. I think she might have been on that podcast finally, I think,
Okay.
but she in her many years in between wasn't, broadcasting things. But she was definitely hurt, and it was not fair to what they did.
Yeah, which is another one of those heart, just your heart aches kind of stories. What when you look, we got about 5 or so more minutes here. I read, I don't know when it was, 5 6 years ago, Paul David Tripp's book Lead came out. Kind of he wrote Dangerous Calling, then he wrote
Dangerous
Lead.
Calling. Okay, I read Dangerous Calling. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he wrote Lead, which I appreciated because there are a lot of books about leadership and that's individual focused, but he talked about the type of environment you need to build in a local church that then produces healthy leaders and centers it largely on the dynamics of an elder board and their willingness and ability to call things out, to step into lives, to have, plans for spiritual health and spiritual life for the lead pastor specifically. And looking back, do you feel like, did you learn anything as far as eldering goes and lead pastoring goes and how environments you may create differently if you were to plant a church again? Just kind of knowing what Mars Hill went through and kind of what you've been through personally.
I'd have to answer that mostly in the negative. I don't think that was really done. I think the training that we did and all was theological, like really good at that,
Mm.
but I think also what it created looking back on it, and it didn't take much to look back either. We had to deal with this. It was some arrogance. We had, we saw some young guys that really took on to the theology, and they were sharp minds, amazing. And we found ourselves having to deal with it because
Mm.
there was an arrogance that came with it. And I teach this stuff all the time, and I'm a really big believer in theology. At the same time, the idea of knowledge puffeth up and love edifies
Yeah,
is a reality.
it is
I don't think I think some people use that to negate knowledge, and the Bible's all about knowledge and teaching and all these things.
for sure.
But I think when it's done in a way that it's just for head knowledge or just to make us smarter, I think, yeah, it causes a lot of problems. And I think whereas, Mark did a lot of leadership conferences. I mean, he created, big conferences, obviously, and brought leaders in. But I think looking back on it, there wasn't much of a discipleship to look at leadership from a different angle other than a theological angle.
Gotcha.
Um, so complementarianism became a very theological thing, not a pastoral thing. And I think that the
I'm gonna cut
pastor's
you off
heart.
right there. I'm gonna cut you off right there. That's a great line. If theology for theology's sake, it doesn't necessarily produce a pastoral heart. That
No,
it it can honestly do the opposite. That's what we're talking about, knowledge puffing up. So that is, I
yeah,
just wanted to cut you off because that's a fantastic distinction. Is if the theological and the pastoral don't come together, then we're doing something wrong in that environment.
absolutely. One of the things I do a lot of teaching overseas with pastors is if your theology doesn't work its way out into love and service of people, there's something wrong with the theology, even though you might say, well, academically, it looks pretty good. There's a misstep there because, Jesus asked the two biggest laws. It's love the Lord your God with heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbors yourself. And the more I study the concept of love in Scripture, it gets misused all the time. But love is a rubric of
Sure.
Paul, I use 1 Timothy 1:5 all the time. The goal of our teaching, our doctrine is the word, is love.
Love.
And I use that all the time with pastors. The goal of your doctrine is love. And if it doesn't work towards that, there's something problematic with your doctrine. It's either completely wrong or it's not being understood in a way that would work its way into pastoral care.
Yeah. And
And
I think, what the late Tim Keller, would say it is when it's just truth, it leads to being harsh.
absolutely. And
There's a harshness that comes from intellectualism only.
yes, we really need both. And this is what I tell pastors all the time. Because you usually get, hey, I'm very pastoral, love people, don't know a thing about the Bible. Or, or the other side is, that's all I need. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's problematic. I think we need to be theological pastors or theologian pastors, however we want to look at it. But the pastoral part, I don't think we did a great job of training in that realm. And that's a big thing for me now. Is part of, how do you, like Dangerous Calling was very interesting, by the way, Tripp's book, Dangerous Calling, because you're sitting there going, wow, I've seen that myself or whatever, certain things. And,
but nobody really walking you through it in real time.
right,
And that's,
right.
obviously promo for Downline. But one of the reasons why I love being part of this ministry is the definition of discipleship is life and truth transference in the context of relationship.
Yeah,
Which
that's awesome.
that necessarily means it can't simply be accomplished in a classroom.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's a very key thing is how knowledge works its way into who we are as people, our emotions, our will, and doing the things that God's called us to do. I think is imperative in all.
Dr. Gunn, I mean, by the way, there's your name almost has to be made up. No linebacker should naturally be able to have the last name Gunn. Too perfect.
I know. I thought it was my calling. Gosh, it didn't work out. Yeah, I was gonna name my son Jesse James Gunn, because, and he was a quarterback, and he was gonna be a quarterback. He ended up as a quarterback. But imagine that, the gunslinger. I mean, come on, as a quarterback too.
I'm sure Donna stepped in.
She cut it down. It was me and a bunch of kids in the youth group. So you can imagine these 15, 16-year-olds and me going, that'd be really cool.
All terrible ideas come true.
I brought it home to my wife, and it ended that. So,
hey, I think as people have listened, they understand why I just love and appreciate you so much. And thanks for your time. I
sure.
love adding your voice to the Downline community and getting kind of personal with us. And one thing I will tell our folks is Mike does not I think maybe you've done one other interview ever, even talking about this subject. So the fact that you'd be willing to give this to us means a lot to me, and I know God's going to use it. So thanks a lot, bud.
Sure, man. I do it because I love you, man. I haven't done many, and I'm very reluctant usually.
Yeah.
So, cool.
Well, hey, we'll do a part 3 later this spring. We're going to dive more into that kind of cultural intersection of the gospel, and you're going to teach us how to evaluate a culture and intersect it. So I'm excited about that.
Sounds good, man. Cool.
All right.
God bless, brother. Bye.